Nathan Carter had seen his fair share of battles, but none had prepared him for the one unfolding in his suburban neighborhood. After serving 10 years in the military, he had dreamed of a peaceful retirement in a small town, far away from the chaos of his past. His new home, a cozy ranch-style house with a spacious backyard, was his sanctuary. A place where he could enjoy quiet mornings with a cup of coffee and evenings grilling in his backyard. At least, that's what he thought it would be. Nathan's property was his pride and joy. The garden was carefully tended to, the grass mowed perfectly, and the small wooden deck was ideal for weekend BBQs. His chickens, which he had raised as a hobby, provided fresh eggs every morning. Everything in his life felt right, a perfect balance of peace and routine. But that tranquility was about to be shattered by an unexpected enemy. Karen, the president of the HOA. It started with a simple letter, an official warning about his backyard barbecue. The letter, filled with technical jargon and obscure references to HOA rules, claimed that Nathan was violating noise ordinances by hosting gatherings in his yard. It was absurd. He'd only had a handful of friends over for a casual cookout. Yet Karen, with her clipboard and her insufferable attitude, was determined to make his life miserable. Nathan had met Karen only a few times since moving into the neighborhood. She had an air of self-importance that rubbed him the wrong way, but he never expected this level of overreach. From the moment she sent the first warning, he could tell that Karen wasn't just a stickler for the rules. She thrived on power and control. And now, it seemed, she had decided that Nathan's way of life wasn't the right fit for her perfect, rule-abiding community. It wasn't just about the barbecue. The HOA had been encroaching on other areas of his property as well. First, it was the slight bend in his garden fence. Then it was the height of his grass, just an inch too high. Nathan, who had served his country with honor, never imagined that his toughest battle would be against an entitled HOA president trying to dictate his every move. He knew something had to be done. One afternoon, as Nathan was preparing for another quiet barbecue, he saw Karen walking across the street, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning his property as if it were some sort of crime scene. She looked at the chickens pecking around in the yard, her lips curling into a disapproving frown. Nathan had had enough. He walked out to meet her, the frustration building up inside him. "Good afternoon, Karen," Nathan said, his voice steady. "I've received your letters. I'm doing nothing wrong." "Oh, I'm sure you think that," Karen replied, her tone dripping with condescension. "But this is about the rules, Nathan. And I'm here to make sure they're followed. Your chickens are a nuisance, and this barbecue? It's too loud for the neighborhood." Nathan's jaw clenched. "Karen, I'm following all the rules. This isn't a noise issue, and these chickens are no different than having a dog in your yard." Karen scoffed, glaring at him. "You just don't get it, do you? This neighborhood isn't a farm, Nathan. If you want to keep those chickens, you'll have to get rid of them. And if you want to keep hosting your noisy barbecues, you might have to reconsider living here." Nathan stood his ground, feeling his military discipline take over. He wasn't going to let her walk all over him. "I'll tell you what, Karen. I'll keep doing what I'm doing, and you can keep sending your letters. But I won't let you bully me into silence. Not in my own home." With a final sneer, Karen turned and stormed off, muttering under her breath about uncooperative residents and fighting the rules. Nathan watched her walk away, his mind already racing with thoughts of how to handle the impending battle. He knew Karen wasn't going to let this go easily, but neither was he. HOA's first power move. The very next day, Nathan found another letter on his doorstep. This one was even more threatening than the last. The HOA had fined him $500 for excessive noise and improper use of outdoor space. The letter outlined a series of penalties that would increase with each violation. Nathan's blood boiled as he read the fine print. He had been living in the neighborhood for less than 6 months, and already the HOA was targeting him with petty, unjust rules. Karen had made it clear that her personal vendetta was now official. The letter also included a warning that if he didn't comply within 7 days, they would send an inspector to his home. Nathan shook his head in disbelief. He knew Karen had been lurking around his property, waiting for any excuse to throw the book at him. She had always looked at him with disdain since his first move in, as if his military background and laid-back lifestyle didn't fit her idea of a perfect cookie-cutter neighborhood. $500? For grilling in my backyard, Nathan muttered to himself. This is ridiculous. But he wasn't about to back down. Nathan knew his rights. As a military veteran, he had been through far worse, and this petty HOA nonsense was nothing he couldn't handle. He grabbed the phone and dialed the local city council. "You need to look into the HOA's actions," Nathan said firmly to the receptionist. "They're fining me for hosting a barbecue, an event that was well within legal limits. I want this resolved." The receptionist promised to have someone look into it, and as Nathan ended the call, he felt a spark of hope. He wasn't going to let Karen and her board get away with this. That afternoon, as Nathan sat in his living room reading the HOA rules with increasing frustration, Karen appeared on his front lawn once again. This time, she was walking with an inspector in tow, clipboard in hand, the smug expression on her face unmistakable. Nathan opened the door and stepped out, arms crossed over his chest. "Afternoon, Karen," he said, his tone cold. "What brings—" "Oh, Nathan," Karen said with that same condescending tone she always used. "I'm just here to make sure you're abiding by the rules. The inspector will be taking a look around, and I expect everything to be in order. We can't have your chickens running amok and your BBQs shaking the foundation of this neighborhood." Nathan narrowed his eyes, sizing her up. "The inspector? Really? You're calling in the authorities because of a barbecue?" Karen's eyes flashed with a mix of superiority and annoyance. "The HOA has the right to enforce its rules, Nathan. You should have read them before you moved here. We won't tolerate disturbances, no matter how small." Nathan felt the familiar sense of justice, that part of him honed in years of military service, kick into high gear. "You don't get to control my life, Karen. Not here and not ever." Ignoring Nathan's words, Karen directed the inspector to walk around the backyard, taking notes as he went. Nathan watched as Karen smirked at her own sense of power. The inspector, an older man with a disinterested expression, barely acknowledged Nathan as he walked past, scribbling something on his clipboard. "Well, this is a real waste of time," Nathan muttered to himself. But he wasn't going to let Karen think she could intimidate him. He turned around and walked back inside, making sure to leave the door open just a crack so he could listen in on what they were saying. Karen and the inspector spoke in low voices as they circled around the yard, inspecting the chickens and the grill. She was clearly enjoying this, pointing out imaginary violations like a schoolteacher reprimanding a disobedient student. But Nathan wasn't having it. He walked back outside, ready to confront Karen once again. "Enough, Karen," Nathan called out, stepping onto the porch with his arms wide. "You've gone too far. You want to find me for a barbecue? Fine. You want to target my chickens? Fine. But I'm done being bullied. And if you think you can get away with this, you're wrong." Karen stiffened, her face flushed with anger. "Don't make threats, Nathan. The HOA has the power to." "Don't lecture me about power, Karen. I've seen real power in my life, and this," Nathan motioned to his backyard, "this is nothing but a joke." The inspector, sensing the tension, quickly made his way to the gate. "I'll just make my notes and report back," he muttered, clearly eager to leave the standoff between Nathan and Karen behind. "Good idea," Nathan shot back. "And when you do, you can add in that Karen's petty reign of terror ends here." With that, the inspector was gone, leaving Karen standing alone, seething in anger. But Nathan wasn't finished. He would fight this. The HOA had poked the wrong person this time. The HOA escalates the conflict. The next few days felt like an avalanche of petty bureaucratic power moves. Nathan had been expecting some kind of retaliation, but the level of escalation shocked even him. It started with a second fine, this time for a violation of noise ordinances, even though he hadn't hosted another barbecue since the first incident. The fine was hefty, and this time it came with a warning. If he didn't pay within 10 days, the HOA would escalate to legal action. Karen had upped the ante. It was no longer about just having a peaceful life. It was about asserting control. Nathan wasn't the only one being targeted either. He started hearing from other neighbors who had received similar fines, most of them for the most ridiculous reasons. One neighbor, Mrs. Sutherland, was fined for having her flower pots on her porch, while another, Jack, had been warned for letting his kids play in the front yard too long. It was clear that Karen and the HOA board had gone rogue, using the rules to bully anyone who dared to question them. But Nathan had been around the block enough times to know that you don't just bend to pressure. Not when you've seen true injustice in the world. He knew the laws, and he wasn't about to let Karen run roughshod over his rights. That evening, as he sat at his kitchen table, Nathan decided to take action. He pulled out his laptop and started researching the HOA's bylaws, searching for any loopholes, any violations of the law that could help him turn the tables. As a lawyer, He had the tools and knowledge to navigate these kinds of battles. And he wasn't going to let Karen use her power to destroy his peace of mind. As he sifted through the pages of HOA regulations, he found glaring inconsistencies. Several rules that had been applied in an arbitrary manner. For instance, the noise ordinances that had been cited in the fine were never clearly defined. What constituted excessive noise? No one seemed to know, and Karen had left it deliberately vague so she could apply it however she saw fit. He also found evidence of other homeowners being fined for violations that weren't in the bylaws at all. Nathan smiled to himself. This was his opening. The following day, Nathan went to work gathering evidence. He began recording everything, documenting each fine, each unreasonable demand, and every moment of harassment by the HOA. He also reached out to a few of his neighbors, sharing what he had uncovered and letting them know he was ready to fight back. Some of them were hesitant at first, but after a few conversations, they started to see the truth. Karen wasn't just a strict enforcer of rules. She was an opportunist, using her position for personal gain. Mia Reynolds, a lawyer who lived 2 houses down from him, was the first to come on board. She had been through the same frustrating battles with Karen in the past, and she wasn't afraid to go toe-to-toe with the HOA. Mia had been following Nathan's efforts closely, and when she saw the evidence he had collected, she offered to help him with the legal side of things. "I think we can expose this, Nathan," Mia said as they sat over coffee in her living room. "There are enough discrepancies here to bring a case against them. We can file a lawsuit for harassment and misuse of power. If we rally the neighbors, we can take them down once and for all." Nathan felt a surge of confidence. This was it. He had the backing of the community, he had the law on his side, and now he had a solid plan. They would fight back with everything they had. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Nathan knew it was time to confront Karen and her board members head-on. He wasn't just going to sit back and take it anymore. He was going to take control of this situation, and Karen was going to learn the hard way that no one, not even her, was above the law. The HOA oversteps and the protagonist strikes back. Nathan wasn't one to shy away from a challenge, but the day of the HOA meeting, he felt the familiar weight of the fight ahead. He'd spent days gathering evidence, talking to neighbors, and preparing a strategy with Mia. It was time to make Karen and her board feel the consequences of their actions. As he walked into the HOA's meeting hall, the tension in the room was palpable. Karen sat at the front, her posture straight, her expression smug as always. Nathan knew this was going to be a showdown. The meeting began with the usual routine. Karen's voice rang out, directing the conversation as if she owned the entire room. She called for the standard updates on neighborhood issues, always giving her unsolicited opinions about how things should be run. But Nathan wasn't there to listen to her complaints about flower pots or BBQs. He was there to expose her hypocrisy and abuse of power. When it was his turn to speak, he stood up and made his way to the front, holding a thick folder in his hands. The board members exchanged uncertain glances, and Karen shot him a look of disdain. She clearly hadn't expected him to show up prepared. "I have some concerns," Nathan said, his voice steady but firm, "and I believe the entire neighborhood has the right to know what's been going on behind closed doors." He opened the folder, and the room fell silent as he began to present his evidence. First, he outlined the fines and warnings he'd received, citing the unclear noise ordinances and the arbitrary rules being enforced. He then shifted to the broader pattern of harassment, showing how other neighbors had been targeted for insignificant issues, like the color of their fences or the type of grass in their lawns. Nathan looked directly at Karen. "I've been doing my research, and I've found clear discrepancies in the way this HOA operates. Not only that, but I've discovered that fines are being issued for non-existent violations. This isn't about maintaining property values or enforcing fair rules. This is about power, and it's time we took it back." Karen's face turned red as Nathan continued to outline how the board had selectively enforced rules to target certain residents. He showed the official HOA guidelines, which were full of loopholes and inconsistencies, evidence that Karen had been bending or ignoring them as she saw fit. "I also have a few witnesses here today," Nathan added. He gestured to Mia and several other neighbors who had come to support him. "These residents have also been targeted for trivial violations and unreasonable fines. They're here to speak about their experiences and stand with me against this misuse of power." Mia was the first to speak, detailing how Karen had tried to impose fines on her for having a car parked in her own driveway overnight, even though it was well within the legal parking limits. The crowd murmured in disbelief as Mia laid out the facts. One by one, the other neighbors shared their stories, each one revealing another layer of Karen's oppressive rule. By the time Nathan was finished, it was clear that Karen's reign of terror had caught up with her. The board members, who had once supported her without question, began to squirm. Some exchanged uncomfortable glances, while others shifted in their seats, clearly uncertain of how to proceed. But Karen wasn't ready to admit defeat. Her voice quivered with anger as she attempted to regain control of the meeting. "This is preposterous. I've been working hard to maintain order in this neighborhood, and now you," she pointed directly at Nathan, "are trying to destroy everything I've worked for." Nathan wasn't intimidated. "Order? You've been imposing your own vision of what this neighborhood should look like, Karen. A vision that doesn't leave room for anyone else. It's time for that to change. You don't get to control this community with fear anymore." The room was silent for a moment, then the board president spoke up. "We'll need to review these claims," he said, his voice hesitant. "This isn't something we can just dismiss. We'll take it to a vote." Nathan felt a surge of hope. He'd just made a huge dent in Karen's armor. The community was finally seeing the truth. The next step was inevitable. Karen's power was crumbling, and she knew it. But Nathan wasn't satisfied yet. He wasn't just there to expose her. He was going to make sure she was held accountable for everything she'd done. Karen's final, desperate move. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension as the meeting continued. Nathan knew he had made his case, but Karen wasn't about to go down without a fight. Her face was flushed with fury, her hands clenched into tight fists. She had never been challenged like this before, and the realization that her reign of terror was crumbling was written all over her face. The board members looked at each other, murmuring in low voices. It was clear that they were starting to question Karen's authority, but she wasn't willing to lose her power just yet. "I won't let this happen," Karen finally snapped, her voice rising. "This neighborhood needs rules, and if you're going to disrupt everything I've worked for, then I'll make sure it's the last thing you do." Her eyes locked onto Nathan's, and he could almost see the wheels turning in her head. She was calculating her next move, but it wasn't going to be the legal kind of retaliation he had prepared for. Instead, Karen went for the kind of cheap shot she was known for. Minutes after the meeting ended, as Nathan was heading out the door, he received a phone call from Mia. Her voice was panicked, breathless. "Nathan, you won't believe it. Karen just called the police on you. She told them you're disturbing the peace and that your barbecue was illegal." Nathan froze, his hand tightening around the phone. He knew exactly what Karen was trying to do. She was using her last card, playing dirty. She had no real grounds to call the police, but she knew the authorities would be forced to show up. She was counting on it. The thought of him being dragged away by law enforcement would, in her mind, solidify her position as the enforcer of the neighborhood. "Stay calm, Mia. I've got this," Nathan said, his voice steady. He hung up and called the police department himself. "Hello, this is Nathan Carter. I'm calling about a report of disturbance. I'm the one being accused, and I want to clarify that this is all part of a personal vendetta from the HOA president." The dispatcher on the other end of the line was silent for a moment before responding. "We'll send someone to check it out. But sir, we do take complaints seriously. Please stay at your residence." Nathan couldn't help but smile grimly. Karen had just overplayed her hand. As he waited, he saw the flashing lights of a patrol car pull up outside his house. 2 officers stepped out, one of them carrying a clipboard. They walked up to his porch with the same cautious expression they wore when approaching a potential conflict. "Good evening, sir," the officer said, his tone neutral. "We received a complaint about a disturbance. Can you explain what's going on here?" Nathan didn't even flinch. "Certainly. This is a completely fabricated accusation. I was simply hosting a small gathering with a few friends and family. No complaints from any neighbors except for Karen, the HOA president. She's been targeting me for some time now, and I believe this is part of her personal vendetta." The officers exchanged a look, then the other officer spoke up. "We've received calls like this before. Let's go over the situation." They walked into his backyard, where a small barbecue grill sat, smoke rising from the coals. It was calm, peaceful. No loud music, no rowdy behavior, just a quiet gathering. After taking a look, the officers turned back to Nathan. "There's no violation here," the first officer said, shaking his head. "No noise complaint, no disturbance. It's a misunderstanding." Nathan held his ground. "I appreciate that. But Karen will keep escalating things. I just wanted to make sure we're clear." With that, the officers packed up their things and left. Karen's attempt to intimidate him had backfired in spectacular fashion. She had not only failed to get him into trouble, but she had also exposed herself as someone willing to go to extreme lengths to enforce petty rules. Nathan stood on his porch for a moment, allowing the satisfaction of the moment to wash over him. This wasn't over, but Karen had just made a huge mistake. He knew that this incident would be a turning point in the battle for his home, and that soon enough, the community would see Karen for who she really was, a bully using her position for personal gain. The next steps were clear. Nathan would continue to gather support from the neighbors, and Mia was already preparing the legal documents to take things to court. Karen might think she had won a small victory, but the truth was, she had just signed her own defeat. HOA crumbles and Karen's downfall. The meeting with the police was only the beginning. Nathan knew that Karen's move to call in the authorities was a desperate act, one that would cost her more than just credibility. It was a signal that she had nothing left but intimidation, and now it was his turn to strike back. Over the next few days, Nathan worked tirelessly. Mia, his new ally in this battle, helped him organize the evidence and prepare for the next legal step. They gathered the statements from neighbors who had been subjected to Karen's arbitrary fines, collected screenshots of the numerous violations of HOA rules, and built a case that not only exposed Karen's corruption, but also highlighted the HOA's failure to follow their own bylaws. As they filed the official complaint with the city, the wheels of justice slowly began to turn. The first sign of change came when several other board members, who had been blindly supporting Karen's decisions, began to show cracks in their loyalty. Some, like Mark and Rachel, two residents Nathan had met in passing, came forward with their own complaints about Karen's methods. They weren't just annoyed with her leadership, they were angry about the way she had abused her power to control their lives. Mark, the retired military veteran, was one of the first to speak out in a community meeting. "I served this country to protect freedom, and now I'm being told I can't even have a damn barbecue in my backyard? That's not the America I fought for." His words struck a chord with the other neighbors, many of whom had quietly accepted Karen's oppressive rules for far too long. It was no longer just Nathan fighting this battle. It had become a community-wide movement. Word spread quickly that the HOA was under scrutiny. Neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak up began to voice their frustrations. A petition circulated to dissolve the HOA, and it gained traction faster than Nathan had imagined. As the pressure mounted, Karen's grip on the board started to loosen. The turning point came when a local news outlet picked up the story. Mia had reached out to the press, and the story of the HOA's overreach, paired with Karen's questionable tactics, was too good to ignore. The news spread like wildfire, and suddenly Karen wasn't just a nuisance in the neighborhood. She was a public figure being scrutinized by the media. Karen's reaction was predictable. She doubled down, issuing more fines and attempting to intimidate more residents. But the more she fought, the more isolated she became. The community, once divided by fear, was now united against her. And the more the spotlight shone on her, the more her power unraveled. It wasn't long before the city launched its own investigation into the HOA. Nathan and Mia, along with the other residents who had gathered evidence, submitted everything they had. The city reviewed the documents, interviewed the residents, and discovered what Nathan had known all along. Karen had been using her position as HOA president for personal gain. There were instances of financial mismanagement, selective enforcement of rules, and most damning of all, illegal fines being issued for non-existent violations. In a stunning turn of events, Karen was removed from her position as HOA president. The entire HOA board was put under investigation, and soon after, the board members who had supported Karen began to resign one by one. It was a domino effect. The once feared HOA had been dismantled by the very community it had tried to control. Nathan watched as Karen packed up her things, leaving the neighborhood in disgrace. The joy of victory wasn't just in seeing her leave. It was in knowing that they had done it together. The community had fought back, and they had won. As Karen's moving truck disappeared down the street, Nathan stood outside his home, a sense of peace finally settling in. His house, once under siege by petty regulations, was now truly his. It wasn't just the physical space that mattered. It was the fight for his freedom, his peace, and his right to live his life without fear of overreach. The HOA was officially dissolved, and the neighborhood began the process of rebuilding. No more fines, no more petty rules. The community, once fractured by fear, was now stronger and more united than ever before. Nathan couldn't help but smile as he looked around. The fight had been long, and it hadn't been easy, but in the end, the community had prevailed. Karen's reign of terror was over, and the neighborhood was finally free. The HOA faces full legal consequences. The investigation into the HOA was only the beginning of the consequences for Karen and the rest of the board members. Nathan had never expected the dominoes to fall this quickly, but once the city got involved, everything spiraled out of control for the HOA. The financial mismanagement, illegal fines, and shady dealings all came to light. The more the city dug, the more it uncovered. The first official action was the imposition of a massive fine on the HOA for its illegal practices. The city's report detailed how Karen and her board had not only ignored the neighborhood's own rules, but had also selectively enforced fines for personal reasons. As a result, the HOA was hit with a hefty fine that shook its foundation. It was the kind of fine that would put any organization into financial trouble. But that wasn't all. The city, under pressure from residents like Nathan and Mia, had opened a full investigation into the HOA's practices. Soon, the board members who had backed Karen began to feel the heat. Investigators subpoenaed their personal records, looking for any signs of corruption or wrongdoing. Some board members, particularly the ones who had only joined in the last few years, were found to have benefited from Karen's illegal activities. One by one, these board members were forced to step down or face further investigation. The pressure on them became unbearable. No one wanted to be tied to Karen's failing empire, especially when the media was beginning to take a closer look. A few of the members attempted to defend their actions, but it was clear that the public had turned on them. Nathan, Mia, and the rest of the neighbors who had been working together behind the scenes were finally seeing the fruits of their labor. They had exposed the rot within the HOA, and now the legal system was stepping in to clean up the mess. The once feared HOA, which had held such power over the community, was now being dismantled piece by piece. For Nathan, this wasn't just about getting Karen out of office. It was about sending a message to every HOA in the city. Power cannot be abused without consequences. Nathan had taken a stand for what was right, and it had paid off. The community had stood behind him, and together, they had broken the grip of an oppressive force. But even as the HOA began to crumble, Nathan knew this was just the beginning. There were still more steps to take, more battles to fight. The community would need to work together to ensure that something like this never happened again. But for now, the biggest victory had already been won. The neighborhood was free, and the people who had fought for that freedom were stronger than ever. Karen's personal downfall. Karen's days of running the HOA with an iron fist had come to a crashing halt. But her personal downfall was about to be even more humiliating. With her power stripped away and the entire community rallying against her, the consequences of her actions were just beginning. As the fallout continued from the city's investigation, Karen found herself isolated. The support she had once enjoyed from the HOA board had vanished, and with the dissolution of the HOA, her influence had evaporated completely. The neighbors who had once been afraid to challenge her were now emboldened, and they weren't holding back.